Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Classrooms Without Borders book club. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. It is truly an honor to host you for today's gathering, where we'll engage in meaningful discussions that explore history, memory, and the legacies that shape our understanding of the past and the present. At Classrooms Without Borders, we are deeply committed to transforming education by fostering inclusivity, promoting social justice, and combating hate and anti-Semitism. Through experiential learning and thought-provoking dialogue like today, we create opportunities for reflection, growth, and connection. Over the past 4 years, we have hosted more than 671 virtual programs, reaching over 87,000 participants across 84 countries and nearly every United States. In our schools and community programs, we continue to expand, making a profound impact on students and educators. We are thrilled today to relaunch our book club under the expert facilitation of Dr. Josh Andy, our esteemed educator and Holocaust scholar whose passion for genocide education and Jewish history has inspired countless students and community members. Our first selection, Empire of Rag and Bones, Waste and War in Nazi Germany by Dr. Berg, offers a compelling and unique lens into the ways resource management, war, and ideology intersected under the Nazi regime. Berg's groundbreaking research challenges us to consider the environmental, social, and political dimensions of this dark chapter in history, making this an essential read for anyone committed to understanding the deeper implications of the Holocaust. Dr. Berg will visit us and join us for an event where we'll discuss this book again on March 5th at 4 p.m. I'll drop the link into the chat for you in just a moment. Thank you all for being here. And with that, Dr. Andy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. It's good to see some new faces and old friends. I know Meg and Chelsea are looking forward to trying to do this again. So yeah, this started. This was I guess, a brainchild of Zippy and I's in April of 2020 when we tried to figure out how to connect teachers when the world shut down. And as we sort of reopened and got busy again, we sort of went away from having the book clubs, but I read a couple interesting books over winter break and in the fall, and so I thought we could bring someone back for the spring, especially for people who might be headed with Classrooms Without Borders to Europe this summer. A really good friend of mine, Anna Hikova, who has done some things with Classrooms Without Borders, teaches at the University of Warwick in outside of London. Recommended to me this book when I was in London with her in December, and it's a completely sort of new history of the Nazi regime. We knew they were sort of trying to become economically self-sufficient, but this ties sort of those economic policies with the racial policies, and really shatters some notions of where the beginnings of the 21st century's 20th century's reuse and recycling programs really begin, right? Sort of the sort of ideology. Um, Myself, I'm almost through it. I started reading it a couple weeks ago. Almost through it with catching up with some schoolwork and grading. Um, I, so I think I want to just open it up. Please feel free to use the chat, to unmute yourself and talk. But just initial thoughts. It's a completely different sort of take on Nazi policy, or really delving deep into one particular Nazi policy that touches a lot of other aspects of the regime. What have people thought about the book so far? Um, what questions might be arising already that you might have for Professor Berg in March? Feel free to unmute or put something in the chat.
I
Meg?
so I like when I learned about the Nazis keeping the hair from the prisoner, the victims, keeping the hair, keeping every scrap. And when I watched with the kids when Oprah takes Ellie to Auschwitz, and in the video, you see, and when we went to Auschwitz, you see all the hair, and then you learn they made blankets. And I don't know, first, you think, well, that's just treating them as, animals. But the book kind of opened up it was more complex than that, seeing that they saved every scrap. Um, so that was one thing that I really took away from that. That not that they didn't treat them like animals, they did, but it went beyond just we're reusing everything from the victims. It was everything. Um, they were like hoarders, and it went against their own best interests for a lot of it because of the resources used to save it and transport it and clean it, and like, yeah, it was pretty disgusting, like skimming off the fat
Hmm.
from the bath water and all that. So then you see their ideology and how rigid it was and extreme. um and just so many people were involved in it that it became its own thing. And like, what if they didn't do that? What if they weren't wasting so much time and energy on that? Where would they have gotten? Yeah, so that's some of my takeaways from that. It answered some of those questions, like, what are they doing? Well, I mean, it just was this whole policy. And
Yeah.
even when they were losing and everything was breaking down, that one guy was still going like, "What about my rags?" They have
Yeah.
no money, no resources, and he still wants his rags taken and reclaimed and the money from it.
Yeah. You bring up this notion of like ideology. I think there's always these pieces as you study the Nazis more and more of like, here's what the ideology says, and then here's what sort of goes into practice, right? And um, we know how much they wanted like this clean society, and that was part of it. But then the amount of time and effort and people that weren't necessarily considered part of society, how are they supposed to, you know, fit in to clean up for everybody else? I think there's this, um, especially, I remember I was thinking about this with this reading this book, The Role of Women in the Household, and with Wendy Lauer's book, which was one of the last ones we did, probably, the Hitler's Furies, about women, um, in the East, right? The women who had to become, right? You're supposed to be the League of German Women, raise families, be the housekeepers, put women, the German woman on a pedestal. Yet you need them to be a functional part of the economy, whether it's even in the household, collecting these things. This becomes the role of the woman in the household to recycle, reuse, refurbish. And then Lauer talks about being a part of sort of this imperial game in the East, of occupation. I keep coming back to that. There's what the ideology says, and then how you put it into practice. It's very interesting. Um, a couple questions have come up about like discussions of waste and reuse related to broader questions of human ideology, human value, and disposability. I think that's the one thing throughout the book that Professor Berg does is it really meshes, it dovetails these policies with sort of the genocidal intent. The doctors, Dr. Leonardo Conti, who is part of the psychiatric hospitals in Berlin, who's using his patients to shred rags, right, and sort of get the fibers from rags. Those people are only useful to him until those jobs are done, and then they're no longer. What's it mean to be useful in society under the Nazis? It's a lot of different things. And when you're no longer useful, you become part of that sort of disposable, piece, which leads to genocide. Conti's also part of the T4 program, right? And so you can see there's a lot of molding of these, what we would consider like, okay, how is, um, reuse and collection of rags and using psychiatric hospital, patients to do it, or to ferret them out. How does that have anything to do with what happens at Auschwitz? But Conti, who helps build and run the T4 program, which is the euthanasia program, which of these are now, if we use the same language that Berg would use, is they're no longer they're useless people. He goes on to help build the extermination camps. They use a lot of those doctors that go into the extermination camps as well. There is this Meg, you've been there a couple, you and I have traveled a bunch. With the Nazis, there's this obsession with like cleanliness, or a cleaner society. And in those early chapters, when they talk about where you put wastewater, where you put like the sludge, it is sort of creating like the us and them, right? This material is being sent somewhere out of the cities, but it doesn't necessarily it creates, more disease and things like that, where these big sort of like, I guess, holding ponds and ponds of sludge are. What do others think? Yeah, Chelsea wrote about, it seems really disorganized, right? It seems trial and error, right? I think she talks about a little bit of the beginnings of public health, well, not public hygiene, but sewage, the garbage collection. These are all, at least in Germany and the Weimar Republic, these are all late German Empire, early Weimar Republic things that come into being. Right? Who collects your garbage is very decentralized before the Weimar Republic, and so how do you? I think I think it's important she talks about how you bring about people to buy into the system, right? That the way in which the streets are kept clean becomes a policing issue. To get people, to coerce people to stop throwing trash in the street, to clean up. These become, we've sort of created more felonious society, created these into misdemeanors and felonies. I wonder what people think about, throughout the book, she continues to highlight this is one way in which sort of the everyday German sees themselves as participating at some level in the National Socialist experiment.
Is it used as a way to like get them on board with something small and doable, and then they become part of it, and then everything added on is they're already part of this?
Maybe. I mean, I think that she kept bringing it out of like, um, maybe you weren't going to go to a rally. Maybe you weren't going to join the SS. Maybe you weren't going to join. This is all before the war, but maybe you weren't going to be sort of a fellow traveler in the ideology. Maybe you're a hardcore Nazi. But this is one way in which everybody could sort of participate in what's the Volksgemeinschaft, getting everyone to go, kind of like you're going along, right? Eventually, you're going to have to go along with something bigger. And this is the thing. Initially, she talks about, somewhere in the chapter on garbage, the garbage community, of how there is this spontaneity. There is this like, we want to participate. We want to collect our rubbish. We want to, give our scraps to the pig farms, and we want to make sure that we are collecting our rags and sending them off. And these are things that this is one of the policies that are continuous throughout the war, right? So on the German home fronts, a lot of things change. They're already rationing food. I think that's one important thing to think about. Germany starts rationing food in 1935. The war doesn't start until 1939. But this is by the beginning of the war, certainly into the war, a lot of people were still collecting their food scraps, the recycling materials, but now it's just a nuisance, she says. We're going to go along with it, but it's now, damn it, we have to do this. You know, someone's asking, did their just make them complicit, or were they simply navigating a system that you have little control over? That's a really good question. I think that's one I'll probably have to write down somewhere for Professor Berg. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, like how how complicit like the everyday household is, and just doing these little things. Maybe that's all they do. Um, that they just collect scrap and they collect rags, and when the rag and bone men come through, they give it to them, or eventually it's taken over by the party. Right? I thought that was a very fascinating. You had a whole sort of socioeconomically very depressed people these were the jobs they were doing in towns and villages and cities, collecting these things, and then to push them out to make it part of propaganda, to make it part of ideology. You had the National Socialist people, the party, take over with volunteers going house to house to. This notion of complicity and navigating a system where they had, little control, right, over sort of a recycling policy, reuse policy. Um, to what degree are they navigating to survive, um, to make it through? I think, I'm trying to think of the books I used in class last week about putting the Nazis into power. I teach a whole class on genocide and the Holocaust, and I just got the Nazis into power in terms of where we are in class. Um, and I think it is Ben Hett's book, the collapse, the collapse of democracy, the death of democracy, in the Weimar Republic, where he talks about there is this coercive power, right? The Nazis come to power and they use coercion to get people to go along, but there is a lot of consent in the early years. There is a lot of consent in the German people for everyday policies, and this would be one of them. A lot of what we know I think we all know the end game for a lot of the Nazi policies. I think the one thing to remember with the Nazis is it's incremental, right? And so maybe Meg is onto something where this is something you can all do, and you get people to go along with this policy. You already have food rationing 2 years into 1935. But in these types of policies, there's a lot of consent. A lot of the coercion is against the political opponents, the communists, the social democrats, the press. But going back to ideology, I think this is part and parcel. There's a phenomenal, like, say it's like a doorstop book, right? You can like hold a door open with it. Adam Tooze's book on the Nazi economy. It's probably 600-700 pages. And he said, at the heart of it, all of these decisions I have to make around the economy is based around this notion that Hitler wants the German economy to be autarkic, right? They're going to make everything themselves, or have, or go get it, right? There's only economically, there's only kind of 2 or 3 ways to get what you need. You can trade, you can colonize and take, right? That's the East, or you can produce it yourself. The colonialism, the sort of the imperial part of World War II, will not start until 1939. They do make a lot of manufacturing goods, but they don't produce a lot of food. And Tooze and others have said that one of the issues that Germany has around food and trade is the creation of refrigeration, right? By the turn of the 20th century, German farmers, European farmers are going to have to compete with especially American beef and Argentinian beef, which will be a direct link to sort of why the Nazis can play on the world is not treating them well. And the Nazi policies around economics are, we're going to do everything ourselves. And so that's where Meg says you have to skim everything. You have to try to reuse everything. And Berg talks about like whole categories of what we would consider garbage and waste are now reclassified as reusable. They would have just thrown them out, and this is 37 or 38. It's reclassified. So they had been throwing these things out, but now they need them. Once we get to the destruction of European Jewry, you see one of the reasons we have stuff, personal belongings, and personal affects at Majdanek and at Auschwitz is the Nazis were going to keep it all or reuse it. A lot of those things that were in the warehouses at Majdanek and at Auschwitz are going to be sent to the Reich. Bales of hair, prosthetics, any valuables, things that could be reused, not just sort of gold and silver and I guess like tangible valuables, but things that could be reused for other people.
Another thing I was noticing in what she talked about was how when their policies changed. So when they were taking over the Soviet Union, they were leaving the farmers to stay alive and trying to give them enough sustenance so they could farm their land and keep them alive long enough to farm. And then when the policy shifted, then they just ransacked those towns and just took everything. And then there was nothing was being grown anymore because they just took everything they could, plunder or whatever the policy changed. And again, I just think like, what they did. I don't know a lot about what happened in the Soviet Union. I'm, focusing more on in Europe. So everything I read is new to me, but like just the how many civilians they killed, just the devastation, not just to Jews in the Soviet. So yeah, so they like it seemed in what she was saying, like against what they would want to do was to give them farmers enough to eat so they could work the fields and give them the crops to then, for whatever, I forget why, or you would know what the reason is, the policy shifted and then they just plundered those towns, which left them with no ongoing food supply.
Yeah, the Soviet, Poland is one thing, right? So the occupation of Poland, it's 7 weeks. It's pretty straightforward in terms of beyond the Nazi policies. It's like a traditional occupation. The army moves forward, things come behind, governmental officials, the SS, etc. And you have everything that has been in place in Germany from 1933 until 1939, as it built up incrementally. It's all enforced at once in 1939, in the September, October 1939. And in what is now Western Poland had been Germany before World War One, and then it was Poland after the war. Um, some 3 million German farmers move into that area, right? Mostly families. The Poles are kicked out. German families are brought in. Those 3 million Germans at the end of the war are pushed out back to Germany. Um, the Polish the farms in the Polish area are going to be used. Um, he can't they can't feed the Germans can't feed their army without like living off of the occupied people. And that's the goal, right? That Germany can't feed itself. That is the lesson, whether it's true or not. It's the lesson that the Nazis learned. So most Germans learned in World War One, right? That Germany is one of the French and British policies is to try to starve the Germans. And so Ukraine and the breadbasket, southern Russia and Ukraine, that's the goal, as is the oil fields of the Caucasus. And until you can get there, you need to recycle, you need to reuse. When a lot of things shift with the invasion of the Soviet Union, mass murder of Jews is not a policy until the invasion of the Soviet Union. It's the same day, June 22nd, 1941. The German army moves in, and the Einsatzgruppen and the mobile killing squads come in after them. Ukraine is also a different story, right? They sort of knew that if they could maybe treat Ukrainians a little differently, they knew there was a Ukrainian nationalist movement, a right-wing nationalist movement that was anti-Stalinist, so they were going to be maybe ally themselves with the Nazis when they moved in. But you're right. At some point, things change. We don't. I talk a lot about it. Live my class to connect, and I've talked about it on the trip before. When the Germans when the Germans have the part of the Holocaust by bullets, where not Jews and socialists are being killed where they live. The eventual plan for the East was to kill most of the Slavic people, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Russians, upwards of 25 million. There are only supposed to be about 4 million slave laborers left after the war in the East, and what was the Soviet Union. So the hunger plan was to kind of do what she's saying in the book, that these Slavic people, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, were going to be, for us, politically expedient, the Nazis would say, to use them, but we can't feed them either. So when they realize if we try to keep them as slave laborers, we can't feed them. And who needs food? The Germans back home, the army. So genocidal policies go into play. Himmler's hunger plan was to kill upwards of 25 million Russians, Ukrainians, and they lost the war. But I think a lot of us have studied it. There is all of these sort of like ironies in Nazi policy that were inherent to people then. I know there are, Adam Chernyakov's diaries in Warsaw, some of the ghetto diaries from Krakow of people saying if we just we can just demonstrate, why would they do this to us? We're their labor force, the Jews in the ghettos. So question, Betty, I did not get a chance to read the profitable war machine, including the fact that it was so successful. Yeah, I think if we look at the not like with Betty's question, I would say look at the party structure and the German state, right? There's these two things. How everything in the East economically, right? So like east of Germany, occupied Poland, the occupied Ukraine, parts of Russia, the Balkans, the Baltics, and the Balkans to an extent. Most most of the economic labor extractive economy of that area is run by the SS. The SS have the SS, the main economic office of the SS. Um, and so it's really successful and sort of like that profit. If we look at just a profit, um, Oscar Schindler is the easy one. I think we all know the story. Oscar Schindler has to pay for labor. He doesn't pay the Jews. He doesn't want to pay the Poles because they have a higher, their rate is higher. Um, he pays for Jewish slave labor, but he pays the SS. That money goes into the SS coffers and trickles into the German economy. But it's not real successful for the German state. It is the SS economy, even the state economy. There's a lot of corruption. Again, Schindler's List is probably the easiest story. Amon Gott, who's the camp commandant at Płaszów, he's got 4 factories in Płaszów that moved inside the gates, right? That he can control everything. He's got Schindler's factory on the outside that's being paid for. Amon Gott is arrested twice at the end of the war, before the war's over, not by anybody that's worried about what he did to Jews, but by the SS themselves for corruption, for taking too much money out of the system. There is, I think it's at Gross Rosen, which is one of the camps in Germany. It is also at anywhere that was like a pretty big labor like concentration camp. You had, by the time the Brits and the Americans could bomb Germany, a lot of things were going into underground. So Messerschmitt was building factories in caves, and that were being run by, as satellite camps of some of the camps. Gross Rosen is one of them. At the end of the war, these were some of the worst places to be. You didn't come out, right? You didn't have like a shift where they were poorly lit, sometimes just by candles. That's great when you're working with jet fuel or, airplane fuel. But a lot of the people who were there slept there in the caves themselves. They weren't able to go out. You had a huge shift culturally in other places because Germany had all these men going to war. And like we said earlier, you can't just put women in factories because that is completely against Nazi ideology. And so they did use, in Germany itself, let's take it out of the East. In Germany itself, beyond the slave labor concentration camps, the labor camps, you had 4 to 5 million Poles, French, Dutch, Danish, and Belgian, like forced laborers that were like kidnapped, dragooned, enslaved, and brought to Germany to work as slave laborers. Volkswagen's probably the biggest, one of the biggest users of slave labor. It's a Wolfsburg factory that's still going. They were the ones also, Volkswagen, that has done the best is the word, has done the most to document that and write about it in their own history. But this idea that had the Germans maybe won in the East, they could have been successful. They knew immediately, much like Yamamoto knew after Pearl Harbor, that it was only a matter of time until the Japanese lost. pretty much every German in the Ministry of Economics, in the economic ministry, what we consider the Department of Treasury, they knew that once they had declared war, they said the biggest mistake Hitler made was to declare war on the United States. Not that he may have had a choice, but economically, they could not compete. As much as Pittsburgh, that's where I'm sitting. I see Alba's in Valencia and Ellen's somewhere in Pittsburgh, I think, right now. Pittsburgh is the arsenal of democracy, right? So much steel is made in the three counties around here for World War One and World War Two that this city pretty much arms the Allies in both wars. But there's a lot of companies, and American industry is diffuse, spread across the nation. A lot of big factories that can be retooled. Germany's economy, and it's not part of her book. That's not the part of the economy she's worried about. Well, I guess the metal, right? This metal reuse and collecting metal. The big industries, steel, coal, the military industries, they're so centralized and sort of siloed, right? They're some of them are very, very family owned. There are these big conglomerates that are building even before the Nazis take over. And so in that respect, there isn't a lot of economic competition, ingenuity. It's highly centralized from not just Berlin and the Nazis, but Hitler himself telling, an engineer, like a plane designer, how to do his job. We don't really have that to an extent. Yeah, I think, another question, many global industries depend on cheap exploited labor. How does this mirror the Nazi era treatment of forced laborers as expendable? How do governments, corporations justify? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't want to make comparisons to Nazi slave labor practices to things today. There are very different outcomes or expectations of what those outcomes might be. But I think in the 21st century, in the 20th century, for most of our history, with capitalism and feudalism before that, right? I think you have the necessity of exploiting labor. The opposite would be like we're trying to maximize profit. And if you take it into Berg's book, there's a whole section of society in Germany they're trying to make money to feed their family, to keep a house. They're the lowest rung of society, that are the rag and bone men that are going around in these villages, towns, and cities trying to collect these things. She uses the term peddlers, and it becomes anti-Jewish as well, right? That there are Jewish peddlers that are doing these, right? Sort of like poor Jews in cities that are collecting the rag and bones, and not an Aryan as well. And I think if you noticed, it's not explicitly Jewish peddlers, collectors are not legally set aside first. It's the society choosing to not use them, right? So before it becomes illegal for Jews to be a part of that piece of the economy, the other peddlers, families, businesses are already excluding them before it becomes legally legal. So in this sense, we go back to ideology. It's this notion of what Tim Snyder would say, like obeying in advance. It's not required yet, but people are trying to figure out what to do. But then, so you have this whole section of, let's say, Aryan peddlers that are collecting all this stuff, and it's necessary for them, right? For their families or for them, it's whatever little money they can collect. And the Nazi party takes over that job. Um, and I think that's the important thing to think about too. And as we read the book, as you finish, we talk about Dr. Berg or anything really with the Nazis. You have, well, I guess say like the Nazis, Franco's Spain, Mussolini's Italy, the Soviet Union for 70 years. You have states like that. You have a party structure, and then you have the government structure. You have these two competing institutions that often at the top of some sort of hierarchical pyramid, the offices and people are holding an office here in the party and an office here in the government. But you have two very much competing institutions that don't always have the same goal or interest. So if we look at the economics, like one, it would have been easier not to be an autarkic state, right? It would have been better for the Nazis, a German state, to rely on trade to get what they needed to. Sometimes that's not their choice because it is the 20s and 30s. We have the highest tariff ever in American history is the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the 20s. Something like 3,000 different goods from around the world, really exclusionary towards the Germans. Just when they need trade, right before the onset of the right after the Depression starts. But when you get into the war, I think this gets to maybe Betty's question too. And Meg sort of brought this up, like they're trying, like all of these things they're doing about ideology seem asinine to like be successful. And it's mostly because it's not coming from the government, it's coming from the party. And oftentimes they're overlapping. But we see this when we get to further on in the war and further on into the Holocaust. January 42, the Wannsee Conference, the ministries are all up in arms for 15 minutes of this conversation about how this plays out from a policy perspective. And the party people and the SS are just like, none of that matters any. Like, you're talking about stuff that doesn't matter. We're telling you what's going to happen. We don't care if the Nuremberg laws say this. We're changing them now. We're not going to do it. We're not going to change them over time. The meaning of who's a Jew is now changed. We're not going to have this big conversation like we did in 1934 and 35. We're changing it right now. And as the war progresses, it becomes increasingly necessary. And goes back to what Meg first started with. You want to win the war, and you want to, there's especially in the East, there are two wars: the war against the Jews and the war against the Soviets. And when they realize they can't win the war against the Soviets after the Battle of Stalingrad, it ends 1943, they can continue to fight the war against the Jews, but they still need all these things. They still need more metal. They still need more material. You're still trying to come up with synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel. So how do you do that? This isn't distinct. I think this is not what Germany's doing is not distinct in a war. In the United States, here in Washington, Pennsylvania, and Houston, and Canonsburg, there were families that created like sawdust tires, right? To retread and reuse tires, and it was a necessity of the war. And they put sawdust in them to make cheap winter tires. So there is aspects of this. I think my mind was when I started reading this was, she really situates this work, this her book. This is where really modern like recycling and reuse starts, which is really, we've always talked about like all the ethics around medical experiments and medical breakthroughs and scientific breakthroughs the Nazis did that we, up until 10 years ago, the main textbook and anatomy textbook in med school was based on the one that Nazis created. But you've got one of the biggest progressive policies around like recycling and climate change and reuse, but it's really couched in the early Nazi period. I find it kind of fascinating in that sense. Any other thoughts, questions?
I have a question about something you said then.
Yes.
So, which is really basic, but so the starvation of the Jews was like if they had more resources, if they had more food, would they have fed the Jews a little better or they wanted them to all die?
No, I don't think they would have.
So even though they were their
Yeah,
labor, they wanted them to ultimately die too.
yeah, yep, yeah. Because you had the policy in the ghettos of like murder through labor. I think, and all this is this notion of documenting. There, you have, I want to say it's like a decree of at the Warsaw Ghetto. We have the decrees from Hans Frank about how many. Officially they're supposed to get 800 to 1,000, about 1,000 calories a day. That's on paper. About 400 to 500 was the average. And if you can't feed, you're not really feeding your people. For most of the war, the Brits did not have food rationing. Right, they were able to get food despite the U-boats and everything. The Brits were able to get food, produce food, reuse too. They may have fed Soviets POWs a little longer, but they were in a different classification. Here's the thing, right? If you always, I tell my students, like, the Germans are supposed to be the master race, and the Slavs are still on the ladder, but they're at the very bottom. Right? They're still they're but they're not off the ladder. Right? The Jews are not even on the ladder. Right? They're subhuman. They're not the same species, and that's a really good way to think about it. And so they might have been willing to feed the Soviets, the Slavs, a little longer as slave laborers. But even then, like when things were going really good for them, they didn't. Right? One of the reasons that the Birkenau was created first and foremost to house Soviet POWs who were supposed to build a massive highway between Berlin and Moscow, and they were just killing them. They were working them so hard, they were dying so fast. And then they brought the first transportations of Jews were 1942. Alba, I see your hands raised.
Are we allowed to just like kind of chime in or something?
Yeah, absolutely.
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah, there's a conflict with my headset. 1 second, I read recently Hitler's Furies. I don't know if you know that book.
Yeah, Wendy's a friend of mine.
Wow, I heard her speak as well. For anybody who doesn't know, this is about the women who participated. We always think the girls are really cute, nice, and sweet, and fluffy bunnies. Not so. And a girl can be just as much of a butthole as a guy, no problem. But the thing is, I have these thoughts that are based upon that book. When a person or an entity wants to start a war, you have to have stuff in a warehouse for at least 4 years. By the end of 4 years, if you haven't won the war, it's just time to give it up because you're just not going to win it. It's just going to toddle on forevermore, and people are just going to like disappear. So it's not just food. Everything comes down to food. The British Isles immediately began to cultivate everything, right down to the soccer field. They were just cultivating everything because that Atlantic corridor, they just couldn't get enough foodstuffs. And before the war, 70%, from what I've read, was the amount of food that was being imported to the British Isles. They had to do something to eat. And when Hitler and his guys started World War II, they had nothing saved up. They were scratching bottom, and the only thing left to cultivate was the trash,
Mm-hmm.
So like, you have to have something like, I had another piece of paper here somewhere. 1 second.
Yeah, but you're right. I think you think of
Yeah.
Germany went through World War One, the interwar period, not great. They don't inherit a stable economy.
No, not absolutely nothing. And the tanks that we see, in little YouTube things, the tanks,
Yeah.
you see them once. They never moved again because they didn't have any gas. They had absolutely nothing to move them. So you have to have food, you have to have fuel, and you have to have seed. You have to have, seed to save the seed so you can have the next year's crop. So the entire East, like you were saying, the Slavs and stuff, at least according to the book, Hitler's Furies, the people there were considered subhuman, and you just work them to death because you have nothing to give them to eat. It all boils down to food. There's nothing to eat. There's nothing to sow for the next year. And if they die off, terrific. 3 million Germans can have a place to go and work and, raise the super race or whatever the hell they want to do. And so there's so many examples of wars that start that they're not going to go anywhere. They're wars of desperation. And so they kind of packaged it really well. I mean, look at the uniforms, at least in the beginning, they look like the Boy Scouts from hell, but they look good. And so that would kind of like bolster up this false idea that with absolutely nothing in your pocket, you can go run off and have a war. And so the whole
It's
idea, yeah, go
yeah.
ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just thinking, you're absolutely right. Like he and Stalin knew they were going to fight each other at some point.
Uh-huh.
Stalin was building up for maybe 42, maybe 43. He was really hoping he could get to 45 because he knew you're exactly right. He wanted to make sure he had the military hardware. In 38 through 40, he killed all of his officers in a massive purge. And Hitler starts rearming in 34. So they are built, but they're not ready. Some of the main officers who are still kind of like, okay, they're really becoming Nazis, but they are military professionals first. They're telling him like, we're not ready in 39. Especially in 41, right? When they invade the Soviet Union, it's still one of the largest ground assaults ever. 3,000 tanks, 3 million men. And the goal is to take Moscow before the winter. And they don't get the army ready for winter. No winter clothes, nothing to winterize the tanks for this winter. And they don't, right? The Battle of Moscow is a stalemate at best for them, but they don't take the city. It's their first big sort of like, it's not really a defeat, but it's not, they don't get the city. Moscow holds. And so after that, Andrew Nagorsky, who wrote a book about a bunch of different books, but one about the Battle of Moscow, he said, that's it, right? Yes, Stalingrad in 1943 is the absolute turning point of the war on both fronts. But really, it's after Stalin, like they have to like pivot after Moscow. And the people who know say like, we need to win fast, otherwise we can't sustain it.
Yeah, sustainability really is really the pivotal point, and it's all based on food. You don't have food, you die. It's that's
Yep.
the end of it. And like the idea of killing off your slave labor, why not? There's just another mouth to feed.
And that's,
So
I think she brings that up that in the book, these are expendables.
absolutely.
They're not, and this is where like a state fighting a war can't do that because they need a labor force. But the Nazi state, because of ideological reasons, absolutely has to do it. Yeah.
Well,
it's
The Germans didn't, like 3 million. The Germans did have the labor force. And if you get rid of all the extra mouths to feed because they're inferior, things, if you get rid of of that, you'll have plenty of room to spread out, and lots of farmers will have plenty of places to work and produce food. The idea of taking groups of people, two different groups, the kind of urbanized group and the rural group. The rural group are like chickens and sheep and goats, and you just get rid of all the extras there. And that's the other thing with farm animals. If you don't have feed to feed them, all the animals in all the zoos were slaughtered. There was no way to feed
Yep.
the animals in the Berlin Zoo. So they just killed
Yep.
them off right away.
Well, you bring up this good point about the seed too, because both Stalin did this to Ukraine in 33 with the famine, and Hitler does as well when it's time to. He wants to early in 33 and 34. He wants to have some success. Let's feed the people, and so they take too much grain. Right? They don't stock enough up for the year after, and they kill too many pigs. Right. So the next year, right. So you see, like, oh my gosh, we have this amazing increase on a graph of production of meat for 1 year.
Exactly. Ink.
Yeah, and then the next year it goes down automatically. So
So if you have this urban group, the best way to farm an urban group, whomever they may be, is to take whatever solid wealth they may have, watches, rings, gold, melt it down. Back in the day, I knew a lady from China who had left China and had come to California. And she told me she had been a part of the Long March, walk around marching, hither and thither, which was one of the ploys to kill off as many people as possible. They were mouths to feed. And then she said one of the other things that Mao had everyone do was take trash iron, from billboards and from old cars and stuff like that, and make homegrown smelting units. The amount of waste, because first they didn't know what they were doing, and secondly, what they set up was utterly ridiculous for producing anything. Very often when some country is based upon a trash economy, recycling trash, more effort goes into recycling the trash to get some usable part than the usable part. And so in the case of, whenever I think of World War II and Hitler, I always think, well, what kind of an idiot was he that he would start a war based on trash? They had no liquidity, nothing, and they decided to start a war. This is like, what was he drinking that afternoon to make him come up with that kind of an idea?
Yeah, I think it's, we've said it all day. It's ideology. It's that there is a timeline, and the people who have tried to talk him out of it in those couple years, or push off a war, there was no talking him through those things. I think this notion too of, I think it was this, taking down the one chapter on garbage there to get more metal. They're asking for aesthetic reasons. We're asking you to take down, your house will look nicer if you get rid of the wrought iron fence and things like that. In that sense, they really did think of every single little thing. It wasn't just the tremendous garbage, right? The notion of going through every piece of scrap, but also, through propaganda, shifting people's perception of what is aesthetically pleasing. What can I do to and other states are doing the same thing. It's just not to this level of people are buying war bonds. In the United States, you have victory gardens and things like that. We benefit from having one of the three big bread baskets, right? You got Argentina, Ukraine, and the United States are the two big sort of like grain bread baskets of the world. And I think you're right, like they don't have anywhere to start either, right? That Germany isn't just the Nazis come to power and everything's great, right? 6 million people are out of work. They come back pretty quick. But I think even further east, I think to highlight like when the Nazis get there, I think for our perception, and this will be my final thought for the day. We don't have to go to 5:30. World War One doesn't stop in 1918 in the East. The Poles are fighting the Soviets until 1922, and really in Ukraine, especially of all places, with the Baltic states to an extent too. But World War One starts in 1914 for the Ukrainians, and they're at war with somebody, whether it's the Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, the Soviets, the Germans again, the Soviets again until 1953. And so fighting doesn't really stop in Ukraine until after almost 10 years after the war. So you have most of the first 50 years of the war of the 20th century at war in Ukraine. And there is something to say about it, right? That it's what they have too, right? Ukraine has coal and grain, steel, and it hasn't been that independent in that period as well. So when they have a chance at independence, they're going to fight for it. But yeah, I'm looking forward to, I think, as we move forward over the next couple weeks, read the book, finish it, come up with some questions. What will happen? We meet with Dr. Berg on the 5th. What I'll do is she'll have, she and I have talked, she's going to do like a 10-minute quick introduction of herself and her work and why this was fascinating. And then she and I are going to be in conversations for 20 minutes, a half hour. And all the time, if you think of questions, just send them to Ellen and I in that chat that day, and we'll ask them. But then we'll have open conversation or open question Q&A after that. But thanks everyone for coming today. I think it is a very deep, dense, short book. There's a lot of material in there. I found that very fascinating as a historian myself. An entirely new way to think about these things in the Nazi state.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for explaining how our next session with Dr. Berg will be run. I just dropped the link in the chat for you to register for that program. I will send the link along. It is a different registration link, but I'll be sure to send it to everyone that registered for today's event as well, just in case you don't get around to registering. I want to thank you all for being here, engaging with this work, all the thoughtful questions that you posed today. Again, we hope that you'll join us on March 5th at 4 p.m. when Dr. Berg and Dr. Andy meet to engage further in this discussion. We hope to see you all again soon. Bye, everyone.